Use a warm, empathetic tone. Emma sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of her grandmother's attic, dust particles dancing in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the small window. The 28-year-old librarian had been putting off this task for weeks, but she could no longer avoid it. Her beloved grandmother Rose had passed away 2 months ago, leaving behind a lifetime of memories packed into boxes and scattered throughout this cramped space above the old house. The loneliness felt like a heavy weight on her chest. Rose had been more than just a grandmother to Emma. She had been her closest friend, her confidant, and the only person who truly understood her quiet nature. Now, surrounded by decades of belongings that told the story of a life well lived, Emma felt more alone than she ever had before. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and continued sorting through the endless boxes. There were photo albums filled with black and white pictures of people she barely recognized, old letters tied with faded ribbons, and china dishes wrapped carefully in yellowed newspaper. Each item seemed to whisper stories of the past, making Emma's heart ache with the weight of all the conversations she would never have with her grandmother again. As she struggled to move a particularly heavy box filled with old photograph albums, something caught her eye underneath. There, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, sat an old cassette tape recorder. Emma had not seen one of these devices in years. It looked like it belonged to another era, with its silver and black plastic body and the simple buttons labeled play, stop, rewind, and fast forward. Curious despite her sadness, Emma carefully lifted the recorder and carried it to a spot where the light was better. She used an old cloth to wipe away the dust, revealing the machine's original shine underneath. The weight of it felt solid and real in her hands, like something that had been built to last through many years of use. She noticed that there was already a cassette tape inside the machine. The tape was unlabeled, giving no hint about what it might contain. Emma wondered if it might be old music that her grandmother had enjoyed, or perhaps family recordings from long ago. Without really thinking about what she was doing, she pressed the play button, not knowing that this simple action was about to change everything. The machine made a soft clicking sound as it came to life, and then the attic filled with the sound of a gentle, warm voice. It was clearly an elderly man speaking, and there was something immediately comforting about the way he talked. His voice carried the kind of wisdom that comes only with age and experience, but it was also filled with genuine kindness. "Hello, dear friend," the voice began, and Emma felt a small shiver run down her spine. It was as if this stranger was speaking directly to her, even though she knew the recording must have been made years ago. "If you are hearing this, then perhaps you are going through a difficult time right now. I want you to know before anything else, that you are not alone in whatever you are facing." Emma stopped moving completely. She sat perfectly still on the dusty floor, holding her breath as the man's voice continued to fill the quiet space around her. There was something about the way he spoke that made her feel like he somehow knew exactly what she was going through, even though that was impossible. The man went on to share a beautiful poem about finding light in the darkest places. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the words, painting pictures of hope and resilience that seemed to speak directly to Emma's wounded heart. After the poem, he talked about how the most difficult challenges in life often become the experiences that teach us the most about our own inner strength. "Sometimes," the voice said gently, "we have to walk through the valley of sadness before we can appreciate the mountain of joy that waits on the other side. But please remember, dear friend, that even in the valley, you are never walking alone." Emma found herself hanging on every single word. For the first time since her grandmother's funeral, she felt a small but real spark of comfort warming her chest. This complete stranger, whose name she did not even know, seemed to understand her pain in a way that no one else had been able to do. His voice carried such genuine care and compassion that she almost felt like crying, but for the first time in months, they would have been tears of relief rather than pure sadness. When the recording ended after about 15 minutes, Emma immediately rewound the tape and listened to the entire thing again. Then she did it a third time, memorizing every word and letting the stranger's kindness wash over her like warm sunlight on a cold day. As she finally turned off the machine and sat in the quiet attic, Emma found herself wondering who this mysterious man could possibly be. How had his recording ended up with her grandmother's belongings? And more importantly, were there more of these incredible messages waiting to be discovered? Use a warm, empathetic tone. Emma woke up the next morning with something she had not felt in months, a sense of purpose. The mysterious voice from the tape recorder had given her the first peaceful night of sleep she had experienced since her grandmother's passing. As she drank her morning coffee, she found herself thinking about the kind stranger and wondering if there might be more recordings hidden somewhere in the attic. She climbed the narrow stairs to the attic with fresh energy, carrying a small notebook and pen with her this time. The dusty space that had felt overwhelming just yesterday now seemed full of possibilities. Emma began searching through boxes more carefully, looking for anything that might contain more of those precious recordings. In the third box she opened, tucked between old sweaters and winter coats, Emma discovered something that made her heart race with excitement. There was a small wooden crate filled with cassette tapes, each one carefully labeled with dates written in her grandmother's familiar handwriting. The dates spanned over 15 years, from 1985 all the way to 2001. Emma carefully lifted each tape, reading the dates aloud to herself. Some were labeled with simple dates like March 1987 or December 1993, while others had small notes written beside them in her grandmother's careful script. One tape had 4 difficult days written in faded blue ink, while another simply said poetry and hope. She selected a tape from 1989 and placed it in the old recorder. As the familiar warm voice filled the attic once again, Emma felt like she was being reunited with a dear friend. This time, the man introduced himself properly at the beginning of his recording. "Hello again, my friend. My name is William, and I am speaking to you from my small study on a quiet Sunday afternoon in September. I hope that wherever you are and whenever you are hearing this, you are finding moments of peace in your day." Emma wrote his name carefully in her notebook, finally having something concrete to hold on to. As she listened to more tapes over the following hours, she began to piece together small details about William's life. He mentioned enjoying his morning walks through the local park, reading books by the fireplace on cold evenings, and tending to a small garden behind his house. In one particularly moving recording from 1991, William shared something deeply personal. "I know what it feels like to believe that your world has completely fallen apart," he said, his voice carrying a weight of real understanding. "I lost my dear wife Margaret 5 years ago to a long illness, and I honestly thought that my life was over. For months I could barely get out of bed in the morning." Emma found herself leaning closer to the recorder, feeling a deep connection to this man's pain. She understood exactly what he meant about the world falling apart, because that was precisely how she felt about losing her grandmother. William continued speaking, and his words seemed to reach directly into Emma's heart. "But I learned something important during those dark months. I discovered that even when we are drowning in our deepest sadness, we still have the power to throw a rope to someone else who is struggling. Sometimes helping others heal becomes the path to healing ourselves." As Emma listened to tape after tape, she began to understand that William had created these recordings specifically to comfort people who were going through difficult times. He never spoke about himself in a boastful way or tried to make his own problems seem more important than others. Instead, he shared his experiences like gifts, offering them to anyone who might find comfort in knowing that someone else had walked through similar darkness and found their way back to the light. Each recording felt like a personal letter written just for her. William shared beautiful poems about resilience and hope, told gentle stories about finding meaning in difficult circumstances, and offered practical advice about taking life one day at a time. His voice became like a warm blanket on cold nights, surrounding Emma with the feeling that she was truly understood. Emma started taking detailed notes about everything William mentioned, trying to build a picture of who this remarkable man was. She wrote down the names of books he referenced, the poems he quoted, and any small details about his daily life that he shared. She found herself wondering how these tapes had come to be in her grandmother's possession and whether her grandmother had found the same comfort in William's voice that Emma was experiencing now. Working at the town library suddenly felt like an advantage rather than just a job. Emma realized that she had access to old newspapers, phone directories, and local records that might help her learn more about William. The idea of researching this kind stranger filled her with the first real excitement she had felt since her grandmother's death. As the sun began to set and the attic grew dim, Emma carefully rewound the last tape she had been listening to and placed all of William's recordings back in their wooden crate. She carried the crate downstairs to her grandmother's living room, where she could listen to more recordings in comfort. For the first time in months, Emma felt like she had a reason to look forward to tomorrow. Use a warm, empathetic tone. Emma arrived at the library early the next Monday morning, her notebook filled with questions about the mysterious William whose voice had become such an important part of her daily routine. She had spent the entire weekend listening to his recordings, and each tape had given her small clues about his life that she was determined to piece together like a puzzle. Her first stop was the reference section, where thick phone books from past decades were stored on dusty shelves. Emma pulled down the directory from 1985 and began searching through the pages, running her finger down columns of names until she found what she was looking for. There it was, printed in small black letters, Thompson, William, 42 Maple Street. Her heart began beating faster as she copied the address into her notebook. She found William Thompson listed in phone books from 1985 all the way through 1998, always at the same Maple Street address. After 1998, his name disappeared completely from the directories. Emma wondered what had happened to him and whether he had moved away from their small town or if something more serious had occurred. The next step in her search took her to the library's collection of old local newspapers. These were stored on microfilm, and Emma had to use the old viewing machine to scroll through years of community news. She searched for any mention of William Thompson, not knowing exactly what she might find but hoping for some piece of information that would help her understand more about this man who had touched her life so deeply. After 2 hours of careful searching, Emma found her first real breakthrough. In the obituary section of a newspaper from October 1986, she discovered a death notice for Margaret Thompson, age 67, beloved wife of William Thompson. The short paragraph mentioned that Margaret had died after a long battle with cancer and that she was survived by her husband William, a retired English teacher at the local high school. Emma felt tears forming in her eyes as she read about Margaret's death. This explained so much about William's recordings and why his voice carried such deep understanding of loss and grief. He had not been speaking from theory or imagination when he talked about the pain of losing someone you love. He had lived through that terrible experience himself. She continued searching through more newspapers and found several small articles that mentioned William Thompson over the years. There was a brief piece from 1987 about retired teachers volunteering to help with adult literacy programs. William's name was listed among those who donated their time to help adults learn to read better. Another article from 1991 mentioned him as someone who regularly visited patients at the local hospital, though it did not give any details about what kind of visiting he did. The most interesting discovery came when Emma decided to ask some of the older librarians if they remembered anything about William Thompson. She approached Mrs. Patterson, who had worked at the library for over 30 years and knew almost everyone in town. "William Thompson?" Mrs. Patterson repeated, her face lighting up with recognition. "Oh my goodness, I remember him very well. He was such a gentle soul, that man. He used to come in here regularly during the late 1980s and 1990s, always carrying a small bag with cassette tapes inside." Emma felt her excitement growing as Mrs. Patterson continued talking. "He would ask me if we had any patrons who seemed to be going through difficult times, people who looked sad or worried when they came in. William would give me these tapes he had made and ask me to offer them to anyone who might need some encouragement. He never wanted any credit or recognition for it. He just wanted to help people feel less alone." Mrs. Patterson paused and smiled at the memory. "I always thought it was such a beautiful thing he was doing. He told me once that after his wife died, he had felt completely lost and hopeless. Making those tapes and sharing them with others was his way of turning his own pain into something that could help heal other people's hearts." Emma could barely contain her emotions as she listened to this story. Everything was starting to make sense now. William had not just made those recordings for himself. He had created them specifically to be shared with people who were struggling, people who needed to hear that they were not alone in their difficulties. "Do you know what happened to him?" Emma asked. "I noticed his name disappeared from the phone books after 1998. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew sadder. "William moved away to live with his daughter sometime around 1999. His health was getting worse and he could not take care of himself anymore. I heard through mutual friends that he passed away a few years later, but I was never sure exactly when." The final piece of Emma's discovery came when Mrs. Patterson mentioned something that made Emma's heart feel like it might burst with emotion. "Your grandmother Rose used to volunteer at the hospital during those same years. I wonder if she ever encountered William's tapes there. He made sure that copies were always available in the hospital waiting rooms and patient areas." Emma realized that her beloved grandmother must have received one of William's tapes during her own difficult times, perhaps when she was dealing with her own health problems or helping other patients through theirs. Rose had kept those tapes all these years, never knowing that someday they would provide the exact comfort that her granddaughter would desperately need. Use a warm, empathetic tone. Emma arrived at the library. Emma dialed the phone number she had found in an old address book questions about the mysterious William whose voice had become such an important part of her daily routine, who had been listed as William Thompson's emergency contact in some old library volunteer records. Emma had no idea if the number would still work together like a puzzle. but it
Her
was her
first
only
stop was
lead
the
to
reference
finding
section,
someone who had known
where
William
thick phone
personally.
books from past
The
decades
phone
were
rang
stored
3
on
times
dusty
before a
shelves.
woman's voice
Emma
answered.
pulled down the directory
Hello.
from
Emma
1985
took a
and
deep
began
breath,
searching through
suddenly
the pages,
feeling nervous
running
about
her
this
fingers down
conversation that she
columns
had
of
been
names
planning
until
for
she
days.
found what she was looking
Hello,
for.
my name is Emma.
There it was,
I'm
printed
calling
in
because
small
I
black
think you might
letters.
be the daughter
Thompson,
of William
William,
Thompson.
42 Maple
I found
Street.
some cassette
Her
tapes that
heart
belonged
began
to him,
beating
and I was
faster
hoping
as
to
she
learn more
copied the
about
address
him.
into her notebook.
There was a moment of
She
silence
found
on the
William
other end
Thompson
of the line,
listed in
and
phone
then
books
Emma
from
heard a sharp
1985
intake of
all the
breath.
way through
Oh my
1998.
goodness, always
The
at
woman
the
said,
same Maple
her
Street
voice
address.
suddenly filled with
After
excitement and
1998,
emotion.
his name
You found my
disappeared
father's
completely
tapes?
from the directories.
I cannot believe it.
Emma wondered what
My
had
name is
happened to
Helen,
him
and
and
yes,
whether he
William
had
moved
moved
away
away
from
from
their small
Where
town,
on
or if
earth did
something
you
more
find his
serious had
recordings?
occurred. The
Emma
next
felt
step in her
relief
search
washed
took
over
her
her
to
as
the
she
library's
explained how she
collection
had
of old
discovered the
local
tapes in her
newspapers.
grandmother's attic
These were
and how
stored
much
on
comfort they had
microfilm,
brought her
and
during
Emma
her
had
time
to
of
use
grief.
the old viewing machine
Helen
to
listened
scroll
to every
through years
word
of
with
community
obvious
news.
interest, occasionally
Occasionally
making
making
small
mention of
sounds
William
of
Thompson,
understanding
not
and
knowing
amazement.
exactly what she
Dad
might
would be
find, but hoping
absolutely
for some
thrilled
piece
to
of
know that his
information that would
recordings
help
are
her
still
understand
helping
more
people.
about this man
Helen
who had
said,
touched
her
her life
voice
so
thick with
deeply.
emotion.
After 2
He
hours of
passed away
careful
3 years
searching,
ago,
Emma
but he
found her
continued
first real
making those
breakthrough.
tapes right up
In the
until his final
obituary
months.
section of a newspaper
Even when
from
he was
October
very sick,
1986,
he would insist on
she discovered
recording
a death
messages
notice
whenever
from
he
Margaret
felt strong
Thompson,
enough.
age 67,
Helen's voice carried the
beloved
same
wife of
warmth
William
and kindness
Thompson.
that Emma had
The
heard
short
in her
paragraph
father's
mentioned that
recordings,
Margaret had
and Emma
died after a
immediately
long
felt
battle with
comfortable
cancer,
talking
and
with
that
her.
she was survived
When
by
Helen
her husband
invited her
William,
to visit
a
the
retired
following
English
weekend,
teacher at the
Emma
local high
accepted
school.
without hesitation.
Emma felt tears
She had
forming
so
in
many
her eyes
questions
as she
about
read
William
about
and felt drawn
Margaret's
to learn
death.
everything
This
she could
explained so
about the
much
man
about
whose
William's
voice had become
recordings
such
and
an
why his
important
voice
part of her
carried
healing
such deep
process.
understanding of
The
loss
drive
and
to the
grief.
next town took
He had
about
not
an
been
hour,
speaking from
and Emma
theory
spent
or
the entire
imagination
time
when he
wondering
talked
what
about
Helen
the
would
pain
be
of
like
losing
and what
someone
she
you
might
love.
learn about William.
He had lived through that
She parked
terrible
in front of a
experience
small
himself.
yellow house with a
She
beautiful
continued
garden
searching
in the
through
front
more
yard,
newspapers
and
and found
before she
several
could even
small
knock on the
articles
door,
that mentioned
it
William
opened to
Thompson
reveal a
over the
woman in
years.
her 60s with
There was a
kind
brief
eyes
piece
and a
from
warm smile that
1987 about
reminded Emma
retired teachers
immediately of her
volunteering to
father's
help
gentle
with adult
voice.
literacy programs.
Helen welcomed Emma
William's
into her
name was
cozy
listed
living
among
room,
those who
which was
donated
filled
their
with
time to help
photographs and
adults
books
learn
that
to
clearly
read
showed
better.
a family that
Another
valued
article
learning
from
and kindness.
1991 mentioned
Over
him
tea
as
and
someone who
homemade
regularly
cookies, Helen
visited
began
patients
sharing
at the local
stories about her
hospital,
father that
though it
painted
did
a
not
picture
give
of
any
a truly
details about
remarkable
what kind
man.
of visiting he
Dad
did.
was always
The
someone who
most
believed
interesting
deeply in
discovery
the power
came
of
when
human
Emma decided
connection.
to ask
Helen
some of the older
explained as she showed
librarians if
Emma
they
old
remembered
photographs
anything
of
about William Thompson.
Even when I was a
She
little girl,
approached
he would
Mrs.
tell me that
Patterson,
every
who had
person we
worked at
meet
the
is fighting
library
some
for
kind
over
of battle
30
that we
years
know
and knew
nothing
almost
about,
everyone in
and that
town.
our job is to be
William
kind to
Thompson?
everyone because we never
Mrs.
know when our
Patterson
kindness
repeated,
might be
her
exactly
face
what
lighting
someone
up
needs
with
to keep going.
recognition.
Emma
Oh my
studied the
goodness, I remember
photographs,
him very
seeing
well.
William at different
He was
stages
such
of
a
his
gentle
life.
soul, that man.
In every picture,
He used to come
his
in here
eyes held the
regularly
same
during the
gentle
late
warmth that she
1980s
had
and
heard in his
1990s.
voice.
There
Always
were
carrying a
photos of
small
him
bag
teaching
with
in his
cassette tapes
classroom,
inside.
working in his garden,
Emma felt
and
her
spending
excitement
time with his
growing as
family.
Mrs. Patterson
In several
continued
pictures,
talking.
he was shown with Margaret.
He would ask me if
and
we
Emma
had any
could see the
patrons who
deep
seemed
love
to be
between
going
them
through
in the way
difficult
they looked
times.
at each other.
You know, people who
Helen
looked sad or
continued
worried
sharing
when they came
memories,
in.
telling
William
Emma
would
about
give me
how
these
William
tapes
had
he had
started
made
making
and
the
asked me to
recordings
offer them
after
to
Margaret's
anyone who
death
might
as a
need some
way to work through
encouragement.
his own grief.
He never wanted any
At first,
credit
he
or
just talked
recognition
into the
for it.
tape recorder
He
to
just
help
wanted to
himself
help
process
people
his
feel less
feelings,
alone.
Helen said.
Mrs. Patterson
But then he
paused and
realized that
smiled
his
at the
words
memory.
might help other
I
people
always
who were
thought it
going
was
through
such a
similar
beautiful thing he was
experiences.
doing.
So he
He
started
told me
making
once that
copies
after his
and
wife
distributing
died,
them.
he had felt
The most
completely
amazing
lost
part
and
of Helen's
helpless.
story was learning
Making
about
those
the
tapes
scope
and
of
sharing
William's
them with
project.
others was his way
He
of
had not
turning
just
his
made a
own
few
pain
tapes
into
for the
something
local
that could help
library
heal
and
other
hospital.
people's hearts.
Over the course
Emma
of more
could
than
barely
15
contain
years,
her
he had
emotions as
created
she
hundreds
listened to
of
this
recordings,
story.
covering
Everything was
topics
starting
like
to
dealing
make
with
sense
loss,
now.
finding
William
hope
had not
during
just
difficult
made those
times,
recordings for
managing
himself.
loneliness, and
He had
discovering
created them
meaning
in everyday life,
to be shared with people
Dad
who were
always said that
struggling,
a voice
people
carries
who
much
needed to
more
hear
than just
that they
were not
words.
alone in their
Helen
difficulties,
explained,
echoing
"Do you know
something
what
that
happened
William
to
had
him?"
mentioned in several
Emma
of his
asked.
recordings. I noticed his name
He believed
disappeared
that when
from
we
the phone
speak with
books after
genuine care and
1998.
compassion,
Our voice
Mrs.
carries our
Patterson's
heart along
expression
with our
grew
message.
sadder.
William
He wanted
moved
his
away
love
to
and
live
hope
with his
to
daughter
reach people
sometime
long
around
after he was gone from
1999.
this world.
His health was
Before
getting
Emma
worse
left
and
that
he could
day,
not take
Helen
care of
disappeared
himself
into a
anymore.
back room and
I
returned
heard through
carrying
mutual
a large
friends that he
cardboard
passed
box
away
that
a
was
few years
surprisingly
later,
heavy.
but I was never sure
Inside,
exactly
Emma
when.
discovered dozens
The
more
final
of
piece of
William's
Emma's
recordings,
discovery came
along
when
with
Mrs.
several
Patterson
journals where
mentioned
he had
something
written
that
down
made
his
Emma's
thoughts
heart
and
feel like
poetry.
it might burst
There were
with
also
emotion.
letters from people
You know,
who had
your
been
grandmother
helped by his
Rose used to
tapes,
volunteer at the
thanking him for
hospital
the
during
comfort
those
and
same
hope he had
years.
given them during
I
their
wonder if
darkest
she ever
moments.
encountered William's
As Emma
tapes
carefully
there.
looked through
He
William's
made sure that
handwritten
copies
journals,
were
she
always
found
available
entries
in the
that brought
hospital
tears
waiting
to her
rooms
eyes.
and patient areas.
In one passage,
William
Emma
realized
realized
that
that
her
his
beloved
hope that his
grandmother
recordings
must have
would
continued
continue
to
to
circulate
William's
long
tapes
after
during
her
his
own
death,
difficult times,
helping new generations
perhaps
of
when she
people
was
find
dealing
their
with her
way
own
through
health
difficult
problems
times.
or helping other patients through theirs. Rose had kept those tapes all these years, never knowing that someday they would provide the exact comfort that her granddaughter would desperately need. Use a warm, empathetic tone. Emma sat in her car outside the library for 10 minutes, gathering courage before walking into the building where she had worked for the past 5 years. In her hands, she held a folder containing a proposal that felt more important than anything she had ever written. The idea had been growing in her mind for weeks, ever since her visit with Helen and her discovery of all those additional recordings from William. She walked straight to the office of Mrs. Davidson, the library director, and knocked gently on the door. Mrs. Davidson looked up from her paperwork with a smile, always happy to see Emma, who was one of her most dedicated employees. "I have an idea for a new program," Emma began, her voice slightly shaky with nervous excitement. "I want to create a special space in the library where people can come to find hope and comfort when they are going through difficult times." Mrs. Davidson listened carefully as Emma explained about finding William's recordings and how much they had helped her during her own period of grief. She described her vision for a quiet corner of the library where people could sit comfortably and listen to messages of hope and encouragement through headphones, without feeling embarrassed or self-conscious about needing emotional support. "I want to call it Voices of Hope," Emma said, showing Mrs. Davidson her detailed written proposal. "It would be a place where people could access not just William's recordings, but also inspirational books, poems, and maybe even recordings from other community members who want to share their own stories of overcoming challenges." Mrs. Davidson was immediately interested in the idea. She had always believed that libraries should serve as more than just places to borrow books, and she loved the concept of creating a space dedicated to emotional healing and community support. Within 2 weeks, she had approved Emma's proposal and given her a small budget to set up the program. Emma chose a corner of the library that was naturally quiet and peaceful, near a large window that let in soft natural light throughout the day. She arranged comfortable chairs and added small tables where people could place tissues or notebooks if they wanted to write down their thoughts. She created a simple system where visitors could choose from different categories of recordings, including grief and loss, loneliness and isolation, finding purpose, and general encouragement. The first person to use the Voices of Hope corner was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been coming to the library regularly since her husband died 6 months earlier. Emma had often noticed that Mrs. Chen seemed very sad and lonely, usually sitting by herself reading newspapers for hours. When Emma gently told her about the new program, Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I have been feeling so lost without my husband," Mrs. Chen admitted. "I come here every day just to be around other people, but I still feel completely alone. Maybe listening to someone who understands would help." Emma watched from across the library as Mrs. Chen put on the headphones and selected one of William's recordings about dealing with the death of a spouse. After about 20 minutes, Emma saw Mrs. Chen remove the headphones with a peaceful expression on her face that had not been there when she arrived. Word about the Voices of Hope program spread quickly throughout the small community. Emma began to see regular visitors who came specifically to spend time in the corner listening to William's gentle voice. There were elderly people dealing with loneliness after losing friends and family members. Young mothers came in feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of raising children while struggling financially. College students visited during exam periods when stress and anxiety made them feel hopeless about their futures. Each person who used the program seemed to leave with something they had not had when they arrived. Some left with practical advice about dealing with their problems. Others simply left with the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggles, that someone else had walked through similar difficulties and found their way to the other side. After 3 months of watching how much William's recordings were helping people, Emma felt inspired to follow his example more directly. She began making her own recordings, sharing what she had learned about healing from grief and finding strength during the most difficult periods of life. Her first recording was simply titled, "What I Learned from Losing My Grandmother," and she spoke honestly about her journey from crushing loneliness to finding purpose and hope again. Emma's recordings were different from William's in style, but they carried the same spirit of genuine care and understanding. Soon, other community members began asking if they could contribute their own messages. A man who had overcome addiction shared his story of recovery. A woman who had survived cancer talked about finding joy even during treatment. A teenager who had been bullied at school recorded a message about building confidence and finding true friends. The program grew into something much larger than Emma had originally imagined. The Voices of Hope corner became a place where the community's collective wisdom and compassion were gathered and shared with anyone who needed them. People began leaving thank you notes, sharing how much the recordings had helped them during their darkest moments. 6 months after starting the program, Emma was organizing the collection when she noticed a middle-aged man sitting in the corner with tears streaming down his face while he listened to one of William's recordings. But these were not tears of sadness. Emma recognized them as the same tears of relief and gratitude that she had cried when she first heard William's voice in her grandmother's attic. The end.